In them Feuerbach applied to speculative philosophy the approach he had already used with regard to religion. Theology had still not been completely destroyed, it had a last rational bulwark in Hegel's philosophy, which was as great a mystification as any theology. Since Hegel's dialectic started and ended with the infinite, the finite, namely, man was only a phase in the evolution of a superhuman spirit. The essence of theology is transcendent and exteriorized human thought. But philosophy should not start from God or the absolute, nor even from being as predicate of the absolute. Philosophy had to begin with the finite, the particular, the real, and acknowledge the primacy of the senses. Since this approach had been pioneered by the French, the true philosopher would have to be of Gallo-Germanic blood. Hegel's philosophy was the last refuge of theology, and as such had to be abolished. This would come about from a realization that the true relationship of thought to being is this: being is the subject, thought the predicate. Thought arises from being, being does not arise from thought. Marx read a copy of Feuerbach's theses immediately after publication and wrote an enthusiastic letter to Rouge, who had sent it to him. The only point in Feuerbach's aphorisms that does not satisfy me is that he gives too much importance to nature and too little to politics. Yet an alliance with politics affords the only means for contemporary philosophy to become a truth. But what happened in the 16th century, when the state had followers as enthusiastic as those of nature, will no doubt be repeated. For Marx, the way ahead lay through politics, but a politics which questioned current conceptions of the relationship of the state to society. It was Feuerbach's theses that enabled him to effect his particular reversal of Hegel's dialectic. As far as Marx was concerned in 1843, and this was true of most of his radical democratic contemporaries also, Feuerbach was the philosopher. Every page of the critique of Hegel's political philosophy that Marx elaborated during the summer of 1843 showed the influence of Feuerbach's method. True, Marx gave his criticism a social and historical dimension lacking in Feuerbach, but one point was central to both their approaches: the claim that Hegel had reversed the correct relation of subjects and predicates. Marx's fundamental idea was to take actual political institutions and demonstrate thereby that Hegel's conception of the relationship of ideas to reality was mistaken. Hegel had tried to reconcile the ideal and the real by showing that reality was the unfolding of an idea, and was thus rational. Marx, on the contrary, emphasized the opposition between ideals and reality in the secular world and categorized Hegel's whole enterprise as speculative, by which he meant that it was based on subjective conceptions that were at variance with empirical reality. Inspired by Feuerbachian philosophy and historical analysis, this manuscript was the first of many works by Marx, up to and including Capital, that were entitled Critique, a term that had a great vogue among the young Hegelians. The approach it represented, reflecting on and working over the ideas of others, was very congenial to Marx, who preferred to develop his own ideas by critically analyzing those of other thinkers. Marx's method in his manuscript, which was obviously only a rough first draft, was to copy out a paragraph of Hegel's The Philosophy of Right and then add a critical paragraph of his own. He dealt only with the final part of the Philosophy of Right, which was devoted to the state. According to Hegel's political philosophy, which was part of his general effort to reconcile philosophy with reality, human consciousness manifested itself objectively in man's juridical, moral, social, and political institutions. These institutions permitted spirit to attain full liberty, and the attainment of this liberty was made possible by the social morality present in the successive groups of the family, civil society, and the state. The family educated a man for moral autonomy, whereas civil society organized the economic, professional, and cultural life. Only the highest level of social organization, the state, which Hegel called the reality of concrete liberty, was capable of synthesizing particular rights and universal reason into the final stage of the evolution of objective spirit. Thus Hegel rejected the view that man was free by nature and that the state curtailed this natural freedom, and because he believed that no philosopher could move outside his own times and thus rejected theorizing about abstract ideals, he considered that the state he described was to some extent already present in Prussia. In his commentary, Marx successively reviewed the monarchical, executive, and legislative powers into which, according to Hegel, the state divided itself, and showed that the supposed harmony achieved in each case was in fact false. With regard to monarchy, Marx's main criticism was that it viewed the people merely as an appendage to the political constitution, whereas in democracy, which was Marx's term at this time for his preferred form of government, the constitution was the self-expression of the people. To explain his view of the relationship of democracy to previous forms of constitution, he invoked a parallel with religion. Just as religion does not make man, but man makes religion, so the constitution does not make the people, but the people make the constitution. In a certain respect, democracy has the same relation to all the other forms of state as Christianity has to all other forms of religion. Christianity is the religion par excellence, the essence of religion, deified man as a particular religion. Similarly, democracy is the essence of all constitutions of the state, socialized man as a particular constitution of the state. In Greece and the Middle Ages, the political aspects of life had been intimately linked with the social ones. It was only in modern times that the political state had become abstracted from the life of society. The solution to this problem, in which the political constitution was formerly the religious sphere, the religion of the people's life, the heaven of its universality over against the earthly and real existence, was what Marx called true democracy. This concept could be summed up as a humanist form of government in which free socialized man was the one and only subject of the political process, in which the state as such would have disappeared. Turning to Hegel's views on executive power, Marx produced several interesting passages on bureaucracy which represented his first attempt to give a sociological definition of state power and reflected, in part, his own difficulties with officialdom when editor of the Rheinische Zeitung. Hegel had said that the state mediated between conflicting elements within civil society by means of corporations and bureaucracy. The former grouped individual private interests in order to bring pressure to bear upon the state, the latter mediated between the state and private interests, thus expressed. By bureaucracy, Hegel meant a body of higher civil servants who were recruited by competition from the middle classes. To them were entrusted the formulation of common interests and the task of maintaining the unity of the state. Their decisions were prevented from being arbitrary by the monarch above them and the pressure of the corporations from below. Marx began by denouncing this attempted mediation that did not resolve, and at best only masked, historically determined oppositions. Hegel had well understood the process of the dissolution of medieval estates, the growth of industry, and the economic war of all against all. Indeed, some of Marx's most striking characterizations of the capitalist ethic were taken almost directly from Hegel. But in trying nevertheless to construct a formal state unity, Hegel only created a further alienation. Man's being, which was already alienated in monarchy, was now even more alienated in the growing power of the executive, the bureaucracy. All that he offered was an empirical description of bureaucracy, partly as it was, and partly as it pretended to be. Marx rejected Hegel's claim that the bureaucracy was an impartial and thus universal class. He reversed the Hegelian dialectic by asserting that, though their function was in principle a universal one, the bureaucrats had in practice ended by turning it into their own private affair, by creating a group interest separate from society. Thus bureaucracy, being a particular, closed society within the state, appropriated the consciousness, will and power of the state. In the battle against the medieval corporations, the bureaucracy was necessarily victorious, as each corporation needed it to combat other corporations, whereas the bureaucracy was self-sufficient. Bureaucracy, which came into existence to solve problems and then engendered them in order to provide itself with a permanent raison d'etre, became an end rather than a means, and thus achieved nothing. It was this process that accounted for all the characteristics of bureaucracy: the formalism, the hierarchy, the mystique, the identification of its own ends with those of the state. Marx summed up these characteristics in a passage whose insight and incisiveness merit lengthy quotation. Bureaucracy counts in its own eyes as the final aim of the state. The aims of the state are transformed into the aims of the bureaus, and the aims of the bureaus into the aims of the state. Bureaucracy is a circle from which no one can escape. Its hierarchy is a hierarchy of knowledge. The apex entrusts the lower echelon with insight into the individual, while the lower echelon leaves insight into the universal to the apex, and so each deceives the other. Bureaucracy constitutes an imaginary state alongside the real state and is the spiritualism of the state. Thus every object has a dual meaninga, real one and a bureaucratic one, just as knowledge is dual real and bureaucratic, and it is the same with the will. But the real thing is treated according to its bureaucratic essence, its otherworldly spiritual essence. Bureaucracy holds in its possession the essence of the state, the spiritual essence of society. The state is its private property. The general ethos of bureaucracy is secrecy, mystery, safeguarded within by hierarchy and without by its nature as a closed corporation. Thus public political spirit and also political mentality appear to bureaucracy as a betrayal of its secret. The principle of its knowledge is therefore authority, and its mentality is the idolatry of authority. But within bureaucracy the spiritualism turns into a crass materialism, the materialism of passive obedience, faith in authority, the mechanism of fixed informal behavior, fixed principles, attitudes, traditions. As far as the individual bureaucrat is concerned, the aim of the state becomes his private aim, in the form of competition for higher posts careerism. He considers the real life as a material one, for the spirit of this life has its own separate existence in bureaucracy. Marx's fundamental criticism of Hegel was the same as that contained in the preceding sections. The attributes of humanity as a whole had been Karl Marx, a biographic transferred to a particular individual or class, which thus represented the illusory universality of modern political life. Finally, Marx dealt with Hegel's discussion of legislative power and particularly the Prussian estates which, according to Hegel, constituted a synthesis between the state and civil society. Marx objected that such a view in fact presupposed the separation of the state and civil society, regarding them as entities to be reconciled, and therein lay the whole problem, since the separation of the political state from civil society appears necessarily as a separation of political man, the citizen, from civil society, from his own actual empirical reality. In order to give himself a historical perspective from which to criticize Hegel, during the summer of 1843 Marx had not only immersed himself in the political theories of Machiavelli, Montesquieu, and Rousseau, he also took extensive notes on recent French, English, American, and even Swedish history, and wrote a chronological table of the period AD 600-1589 that covered 80 pages. These readings led Marx to the conclusion that the French Revolution had completely destroyed any political significance that the estates enjoyed in the Middle Ages. Hegel's idea of there being adequate representatives of civil society was archaic and indicative of German underdevelopment. Hegel's conceptual framework was based on the ideas of the French Revolution, but his solutions were still medieval. This was a mark of how far the political situation in Germany was retarded when compared with German philosophy. Indeed, the only estate in the medieval sense of the word that still remained was the bureaucracy itself. The enormous increase in social mobility had rendered obsolete the old estates as originally differentiated in terms of need and work. The only general difference, superficial and formal, is merely that between country and town. But in society itself, differences developed in spheres that were constantly in movement with arbitrariness as their principle. Money and education are the main distinguishing characteristics. Marx broke off here, noting that the proper place to discuss this would be in later sections, never written, on Hegel's conception of civil society. He did, however, go on to say, in a remark that foreshadowed the future importance of the proletariat in his thought, that the most characteristic thing about contemporary civil society was precisely that the propertyless, the class that stands in immediate need of work, the class of physical labor, formed not so much a class of civil society as the basis on which society's components rest and move. Marx summarized his objection to Hegel as follows: as soon as civil estates as such become political estates, then there is no need of mediation, and as soon as mediation is necessary, they are no longer political. Hegel wishes to preserve the medieval system of estates but in the modern context of legislative power, and he wants legislative power, but in the framework of a medieval system of estates. It is the worst sort of syncretism, since the whole problem arose, in Hegel's view, from the separation of the state from civil society. Marx saw two possibilities: if the state and civil society continued to be separate, then all as individuals could not participate in the legislature except through deputies, the expression of the separation, and merely a dualistic unity. Secondly, if civil society became political society, then the significance of legislative power as representative disappeared, for it depended on a theological kind of separation of the state from civil society. Hence, what the people should aim for was not legislative power but governmental power. Marx ended his discussion with a passage which makes clear how, in the summer of 1843, he envisaged future political developments. It is not a question of whether civil society should exercise legislative power through deputies or through all as individuals. Rather, it is the question of the extent and greatest possible extension of the franchise, of active as well as passive suffrage. This is the real bone of contention of political reform, in France as well as in England. Voting is the actual relationship of actual civil society to the civil society of the legislative power, to the representative element. Or, voting is the immediate, direct relationship of civil society to the political state, not only in appearance but in reality. Only with universal suffrage, active as well as passive, does civil society actually rise to an abstraction of itself, to political existence as its true universal and essential existence. But the realization of this abstraction is also the transcendence of the abstraction. By making its political existence actual as its true existence, civil society also makes its civil existence unessential in contrast to its political existence. And with the one thing separated, the other its opposite falls. Within the abstract political state, the reform of voting is a dissolution of the state, but likewise the dissolution of civil society. Thus Marx arrived here at the same conclusion as in his discussion of the true democracy. Democracy implied universal suffrage, and universal suffrage would lead to the dissolution of the state. It is clear from this manuscript that Marx was adopting the fundamental humanism of Feuerbach, and with it Feuerbach's reversal of subject and predicate in the Hegelian dialectic. Marx considered it evident that any future development was going to involve man's recovery of the social dimension that had been lost ever since the French Revolution leveled all citizens in the political state and thus accentuated the individualism of bourgeois society. Although he was convinced that social organization had no longer to be based on private property, he was not here explicitly arguing for its abolition, nor did he make clear the various roles of classes in the social evolution. The imprecision of his positive ideas is not at all surprising, since Marx's manuscript represented no more than a preliminary survey of Hegel's text, and it was written at a very transient stage in the intellectual evolution of both Marx and his colleagues. Moreover, the surviving manuscript is incomplete and there are references to projected elaborations either never undertaken or now lost. A letter from Marx to Ruge, written in September 1843 and later published in the Deutsch-Französische Arbeitet, gives a good impression of Marx's intellectual and political position immediately before leaving Germany, and of how much importance he attached to what he called the reform of consciousness. The situation might not be very clear, he wrote, but that is just the advantage of the new line, that we do not dogmatically anticipate events, but seek to discover the new world by criticism of the old. What was clear was that all dogmatism was unacceptable, and that included the various communist systems. Communism in particular is a dogmatic abstraction, though by this I do not mean any imaginable and possible communism, but the really existing communism taught by Cabot, Desemy, etc. This communism is itself only a peculiar presentation of the humanist principle infected by its opposite, private individualism. The abolition of private property is therefore by no means identical to communism, and it is no accident that communism has seen other socialist doctrines like those of Fourier, Proudhon, etc., necessarily arise in opposition to it, since it is itself only a particular, one-sided realization of the socialist principle. Moreover, the whole socialist principle is only one facet of the true reality of the human essence. In Germany, the fulfillment of this human nature depended above all on a critique of religion and politics, for there it was these that were the focal points of interest. Ready-made systems were no use. Criticism had to take as its starting point contemporary attitudes. In terms that recall Hegel's account of the progress of reason in history, Marx asserted, reason has always existed, but not always in rational form. In any form of practical or theoretical consciousness, rational goals were already inherent and awaited the critic who would reveal them. Thus Marx saw no objection to starting from actual political struggles and explaining why they took place. The point was to demystify religious and political problems by instilling an awareness of their exclusively human dimensions. He ended his letter, so our slogan must be, reform of consciousness not through dogmas, but through the analysis of mystical consciousness that is not clear to itself, whether it appears in a religious or political form. It will then be clear that the world has long dreamed of something of which it only needs a fully developed consciousness in order really to possess it. Clearly, the problem does not lie in filling some great void between past ideas and those of the future, but in the completion of ideas of the past. Finally, it will be clear that humanity is not beginning a new work, but consciously bringing its old work to completion. So we can summarize the purpose of our journal in one word: self-understanding, meaning critical philosophy, by our age of its struggles and desires. This is a task for the world and for us. It can only be achieved by united forces. What is at stake is a confession, nothing more. To have its sins forgiven, humanity needs only to recognize them as they are. 1. His notion of salvation through a reform of consciousness was, of course, very idealistic. But this was merely typical of German philosophy at this time. Marx himself was very mindful of the intellectual disarray among the radicals, and wrote to Ruge soon after finishing his critique of Hegel, even though the whence is not in doubt, yet all the more confusion reigns over the whither. It is not only that a general anarchy has pervaded the reformers. Everyone will have to admit to himself that he has no exact view of what should happen. It was the intellectual climate of Paris that finally led Marx to make the transition from the realm of pure theory to the world of immediate, practical politics, the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher. While Marx was in Kreuznach writing his commentary on Hegel's politics, Ruge had been busy organizing the administration of the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher. To finance it, he tried to float a large loan in Germany. When this failed completely, he bore virtually the whole cost of publication himself. As a place of publication, Strasbourg, which they had previously favored, was rejected, and Froebel proposed that he and Ruge together go to Brussels and Paris to see which city would be more suitable. At the end of July, Ruge traveled west, stopped at Kreuznach to see Marx, and then, joining forces with Hess and Froebel at Cologne, went on to Belgium. Brussels also proved unsatisfactory, for though its press enjoyed comparative freedom, the city was too small and not politically minded. So in August 1843, Hess and Ruge moved on to Paris with a view to establishing the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher there. It proved difficult to attract contributors, especially ones with a common viewpoint. Both Ruge and Froebel were very active in trying to get German participation, but the liberal writers refused, and of the Berlin young Hegelians only Bruno Bauer agreed, and in the end even he contributed nothing. So the contributors were reduced to those already associated with Froebel through his Zurich publications, Hess, Engels, Bakunin, and Herweg. Their views were diverse. Hess and Bakunin proclaimed their own brand of eclectic anarcho-communism, whereas Froebel, Herweg, and Ruge vaguely called themselves Democrats and emphasized the importance of popular education. As French influence increased the political awareness of the young Hegelians, the slogan radicalism began to give way to the more specifically political term democracy. But the unity of Ruge's group amounted to little more than a wish to further the political application of Feuerbach's philosophy, and their favorite term was humanism. But Feuerbach himself was unwilling to cooperate. Marx considered that Schelling was enjoying a quite unjustified reputation among the French. Just before leaving Kreuznach for Paris, he accordingly wrote to Feuerbach suggesting that he contribute a critique of him. These sincere youthful ideas which, with Schelling, remained an imaginative dream of his youth, have with you become truth, reality, and virile earnestness. Schelling is therefore an anticipatory caricature of you, and as soon as the reality appears opposite the caricature it must dissolve into dust or fog. Thus I consider you the necessary and natural opponent of Schelling summoned by their majesties, nature and history. Your struggle with him is the struggle of an imaginary philosophy with philosophy itself. Feuerbach, however, replied that in his opinion the time was not yet ripe for a transition from theory to practice, for the theory had still to be perfected. He told Marx and Ruge bluntly, they were too impatient for action. All the contributors to the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher were at least united in regarding Paris as both a haven and an inspiration. Their expectations were justified in so far as the revolutions of 1789 and 1830 had made Paris the undisputed center of socialist thought. The bourgeois monarchy of Louis Philippe was drawing to its close and becoming more conservative. The censorship laws had been tightened in 1835, and from 1840 onwards the anti-liberal Guizot dominated the government. But political activity was nonetheless lively for being semi-clandestine, and there was a bewildering variety of every conceivable kind of sect, salon and newspaper, each proclaiming some form of socialism. As soon as he had arrived in Paris, Ruge set out to make contacts, guided by Hess, who was familiar with the political scene from his days as French correspondent of the Rheinische Zeitung. Ruge's account of his tour of the salons is a catalogue of one misunderstanding after another. Each group thought the other a century out of date. Amazed that he appeared so little versed in communism, the French were equally surprised by his being an advocate of atheism and materialism, watchwords of pre-1789 French thought. For his part, Ruge could not understand how the French could be so attached to religion, which German philosophy had spent such long and involved efforts in neutralizing. Lamartine at first described the conception of the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher as holy and sublime, but later declined to contribute on learning of its revolutionary nature. Leroux was occupied with inventing a new printing machine. Cabot was shocked by Ruge's atheism and lack of commitment to communism. Considerant was also alienated, suspecting that the review would advocate violence. Proudhon was not in Paris. Thus, in spite of every effort, the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher appeared without a single French contribution. By November, Ruge began to be anxious even about the number of his German contributors. Herweg was honeymooning, and Bakunin was leading an errant life after expulsion from Zurich. Their absence was offset by Heine who, having been increasingly sympathetic to socialist ideas during his stay in Paris, agreed to contribute some poems, and also by Ferdinand Bernays, recently expelled from Bavaria after being the editor of the Mannheimer Abendzeitung. Marx himself arrived in Paris at the end of October 1843. Jenny, already 4 months pregnant, came with him. They first lodged at 23 Rue Vanneau, a quiet side street in the Saint-Germain area of the left bank where many other German immigrants were concentrated. The office of the Deutsche Französische Arbeiter was on the ground floor of number 22 and Rouge had rented 2 floors of number 23 where Germain Maurer, a leading German socialist writer, was already living. Rouge had written to Marx outlining his project of a phalanstery along Fourierist lines. He invited the Marxes, the Herwegs, and the Moras to join him and his wife in an experiment in community living. Each family would have separate living quarters, but there would be a shared kitchen and dining room. The women would take turns with the domestic duties. Emma Eilerweg summed up the situation at a glance and refused immediately. Eilo could Rouge's wife, a little Saxon woman, nice but characterless, hit it off with Mrs. Marx, who was very intelligent and still more ambitious and far more knowledgeable than she? How could Mrs. Herweg, the youngest of the 3 women and so recently married, take to this communal life? Marx and Jenny did not stay long either. Within 2 weeks they had moved to number 31 and then in December finally settled at 38 Rue Vanneau, where they stayed for the rest of their time in Paris. Marx had brought with him from Kreuznach an essay entitled On the Jewish Question, a distillation of his reading the previous summer on France and America. His central problem was still the contemporary separation of the state from civil society and the consequent failure of liberal politics to solve social questions. The question of Jewish emancipation was now of general interest in Prussia where, since 1816, the Jews had enjoyed rights far inferior to those of Christians. Marx himself had been thinking about this issue for some time. As early as August 1842 he had asked Oppenheim to send him all the anti-Semitic articles of Hermes, editor of the Kölnische Zeitung, who favored a sort of apartheid for Jews in Germany. Marx made little use of this material, but in November 1842 Bauer published a series of articles on the problem in Rouge's Deutsche Jahrhüter. Marx considered that Bauer's view were too abstract, and decided that a lengthy review would be a convenient peg on which to hang his criticism of the liberal state. In his articles Bauer had claimed that, in order to be able to live together, both Jews and Christians had to renounce what separated them. Neither Christians nor Jews as such could have human rights, so it was not only Jews but all men who needed emancipation. Civil rights were inconceivable under an absolute system. Religious prejudice and religious separation would vanish when civil and political castes and privileges were done away with and all men enjoyed equal rights in a liberal, secular state. Marx welcomed Bauer's critique of the Christian state, but attacked him for not calling into question the state as such and thus failing to examine the relationship of political emancipation, that is, the granting of political rights, to human emancipation, the emancipation of man in all his faculties. Society could not be cured of its ills simply by emancipating the political sphere from religious influence. Marx quoted several authorities to show the extent of religious practice in North America and went on to the fact that even in the land of complete political emancipation we find not only the existence of religion but its living existence full of freshness and strength, demonstrates that the continuance of religion does not conflict with or impede the perfection of the state. But since the existence of religion entails the existence of a defect, the source of this defect can only be sought in the nature of the state itself. On this view, religion no longer has the force of a basis for secular deficiencies, but only a symptom. Therefore we explain the religious prejudice of free citizens by their secular prejudice. We do not insist that they abolish their religious constraint in order to abolish secular constraints. We insist that they abolish their religious constraints as soon as they have abolished their secular constraints. We do not change secular questions into theological ones, we change theological questions into secular ones. History has for long enough been resolved into superstition, we now resolve superstition into history. The question of the relationship of political emancipation to religion becomes for us a question of the relationship of political emancipation to human emancipation. We criticize the religious weakness of the political state by criticizing the secular construction of the political state without regard to its religious weaknesses. Thus political emancipation from religion did not free men from religious conceptions, for political emancipation was not the same as human emancipation. For example, citizens might still be constrained by a religion from which a state itself had broken free. What Bauer had not realized was that the political emancipation he advocated embodied an alienation similar to the religious alienation he had just criticized. Man's emancipation, because it passed through the intermediary of the state, was still abstract, indirect, and partial. Even when man proclaims himself an atheist through the intermediary of the state, i.e., when he proclaims the state to be atheistic, he still retains his religious prejudice, just because he recognizes himself only indirectly through the medium of something else. Religion is precisely man's indirect recognition of himself through an intermediary. The state is the intermediary between man and his freedom. Similarly with private property, in America it had been abolished as far as the Constitution was concerned by declaring that no property qualification was necessary for voting. But this, far from really abolishing private property, actually presupposed it. The result was that man's being was profoundly divided. When the political state has achieved its true completion, man leads a double life, a heavenly one and an earthly one, not only in thought and consciousness, but in reality, in life. He has a life both in the political community, where he is valued as a communal being, and in civil society where he is active as a private individual, treats other men as means, degrades himself to a means, and becomes a tool of forces outside himself. Political democracy was not, however, to be decried. For it was a great step forward and the final form of human emancipation inside the present world order. Political democracy could be called Christian in that it had man as its principle and regarded him as sovereign and supreme. But unfortunately this meant man as he appears uncultivated and unsocial, man in his accidental existence, man as he comes and goes, man as he is corrupted by the whole organization of our society, lost to himself, sold, subjected to domination by inhuman conditions and elements. In a word, man who is no longer a real species being. The fantasy, dream and postulate of Christianity, the sovereignty of man, but of man as an alien being separate from actual man, is present in democracy as a tangible reality and is its secular motto. Having shown that religion was more than compatible with civil rights, Marx now contested Bauer's refusal to acknowledge the Jewish claim to human rights, the rights of man. Bauer had said that neither the Jew nor the Christian could claim universal human rights because their particular and exclusive religions necessarily invalidated any such claims. Marx refuted Bauer's view by referring to the French and American constitutions. Firstly, he discussed the distinction between the rights of the citizen and the rights of man. The rights of the citizen were of a political order. They were expressed in man's participation in the universality of the state and, as had been shown, by no means presupposed the abolition of religion. These rights reflected the social essence of man, though in a totally abstract form, and the reclaiming of this essence would give rise to human emancipation. Not so the rights of man in general. Being expressions of the division of bourgeois society, they had nothing social about them. As exemplified in the French constitutions of 1791 and 1793 and in the constitutions of New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, the rights of man did not deny the right to practice religion. On the contrary, they expressly recognized it, and Marx quoted chapter and verse to prove it. Marx then asked, why are these rights called the rights of man? Because they were the rights of man regarded as a member of civil society. And why was the member of civil society identified with man? Because the rights of man were egoistic and antisocial. This was the case with all the constitutions in question, even the most radical. None succeeded in subordinating man to the citizen. All the rights of man that they proclaimed had the same character. Liberty, for example, the right to do and perform what does not harm others, was, according to Marx, not based on the union of man with man, but on the separation of man from man. It is the right to this separation, the right of the limited individual who is limited to himself. Property, the right to dispose of one's possessions as one wills without regard to others, was the right of selfishness. It leads man to see in other men not the realization, but the limitation of his own freedom. Equality was no more than the equal right to the liberty described above, and security was the guarantee of egoism. Thus none of the so-called rights of man went beyond the egoistic man separated from the community as a member of civil society. Summarizing some of the more detailed analyses of his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx showed that political emancipation involved the dissolution of the old feudal society. But the transition from feudal to bourgeois society had not brought human emancipation. Man was not freed from religion, he was given religious freedom. Marx finished his review by declaring that the actual individual man must take back into himself the abstract citizen and, as an individual man in his empirical life, in his individual work and individual relationships, become a species being. Man must recognize his own forces as social forces, organize them, and thus no longer separate social forces from himself in the form of political forces. Only when this has been achieved will human emancipation be completed. In the same article, Marx included a much shorter review of an essay by Bauer entitled The Capacity of Present-Day Jews and Christians to Become Free, which was published in Herweg's 21 Sheets from Switzerland. Bauer's theme was that the Jew was further removed from emancipation than the Christian, whereas the Christian had only to break with his own religion, the Jew had also to break with the completion of his religion, that is, Christianity. The Christian had only one step to make, the Jew too. Taking issue again with Bauer's theological formulation of the problem, Marx developed a theme that he had already touched on in the first part of his article, religion as the spiritual facade of a sordid and egoistic world. For Marx, the question of Jewish emancipation had become the question of what specific social element needs to be overcome in order to abolish Judaism. He defined the secular basis of Judaism as practical need and self-interest, the Jew's worldly cult as barter, and his worldly god as money. He stated in conclusion an organization of society that abolished the presupposition of haggling and thus its possibility would have made the Jew impossible. His religious consciousness would dissolve like an insipid vapor into the real live air of society. On the other hand, if the Jew recognizes this practical essence of his as void and works for its abolition, he is working for human emancipation with his previous development as a basis, and turning himself against the highest practical expression of human self-alienation. The Jew had, however, already emancipated himself in a Jewish way. This had been possible because the Christian world had become impregnated with the practical Jewish spirit. Their deprivation of nominal political rights mattered little to Jews, who in practice wielded great financial power. The contradiction between the Jew's lack of political rights and his practical political power is the general contradiction between politics and the power of money. Whereas the first ideally is superior to the second, in fact it is its bondsman. The basis of civil society was practical need, and the god of this practical need was money. The secularized god of the Jews, money, is the jealous god of Israel, before whom no other god may stand. Money debases all the gods of man and turns them into commodities. Money is the universal, self-constituted value of all things. It has therefore robbed the whole world, human as well as natural, of its own values. Money is the alienated essence of man's work and being. This alien essence dominates him, and he adores it. Judaism could not develop further as a religion, but had succeeded in installing itself in practice at the heart of civil society. In the Christian world, Judaism reaches its apogee with the completion of civil society, but civil society first reaches its completion in the Christian world. Only under the domination of Christianity, which made all national, natural, moral and theoretical relationships exterior to man, could civil society separate itself completely from the life of the state, tear asunder all the species bonds of man, put egoism and selfish need in the place of these species bonds, and dissolve man into a world of atomized individuals hostile to one another. Thus Christianity, which arose out of Judaism, had now dissolved and reverted to Judaism. Marx's conclusion outlined the idea of alienated labor that he would shortly develop at length. As long as man is imprisoned within religion, he only knows how to objectify his essence by making it into an alien, imaginary being. Similarly, under the domination of egoistic need, he can only become practical, only create practical objects by putting his products and his activity under the domination of an alien entity and lending them the significance of this alien entity. Money. It is largely this article that has given rise to the view that Marx was an anti-Semite. It is true that a quick and unreflective reading of, particularly, the briefer second section leaves a nasty impression. It is also true that Marx indulged elsewhere in anti-Jewish remarks, though none as sustained as here. He was himself attacked as a Jew by many of his most prominent opponents, Ruge, Proudhon, Bakunin and Dyring, but there is virtually no trace of Jewish self-consciousness either in his published writings or in his private letters. An incident that occurred while Marx was in Cologne throws some light on his attitude. Just now, he wrote to Ruge in March 1843, "The president of the Israelites here has paid me a visit and asked me to help with a parliamentary petition on behalf of the Jews, and I agreed. However obnoxious I find the Israelite beliefs, Bauer's view seems to me nevertheless to be too abstract. The point is to punch as many holes as possible in the Christian state and smuggle in rational views as far as we can. That must at least be our aim, and the bitterness grows with each rejected petition." Marx's willingness to help the Jews of Cologne suggests that his article was aimed much more at the vulgar capitalism popularly associated with Jews than at Jewry as such, either as a religious body or, still less, as an ethnic group. Indeed, the German word for Judentum has the secondary sense of commerce, and, to some extent, Marx played on this double meaning. It is significant, moreover, that some of the main points in the second section of Marx's article, including the attack on Judaism as the embodiment of a money fetishism, were taken over almost verbatim from an article by Hess, who was the very opposite of an anti-Semite. Hess's article, entitled On the Essence of Money, had been submitted for publication in the Deutsch-Französische Bücher, but the journal collapsed before it could appear. The second of Marx's articles in the Deutsch-Französische Bücher was written after his arrival in Paris. It revealed the immense impact made on him by his discovery there of the class to whose emancipation he was to devote the rest of his life. Paris, the cultural capital of Europe, had a large population of German immigrant workers, almost 100,000. Some had come to perfect the techniques of their various trades, some had come simply because they could find no work in Germany. Marx was immediately impressed when communist artisans form associations, education and propaganda are their first aims. But the very act of associating creates a new need, the need for society, and what appeared to be a means has become an end. The most striking results of this practical development are to be seen when French socialist workers meet together. Smoking, eating and drinking are no longer simply means of bringing people together. Company, association, entertainment, which also has society as its aim, are sufficient for them. The brotherhood of man is no empty phrase but a reality, and the nobility of man shines forth upon us from their toil-worn bodies. Marx attended the meetings of most of the French workers' associations, but was naturally closer to the Germans, particularly to the League of Elite Just, the most radical of the German secret societies and composed of émigré artisans whose aim was to introduce a social republic in Germany. He knew intimately both its leaders, Uhrbeck, a doctor, and Maurer, who had been a member of Ruge's short-lived phalanstery. But he did not actually join any of the societies, although Marx's second article ended with the forthright proclamation of the proletariat's destiny. The first part was a reworking of old themes. It was written as an introduction to a proposed rewriting of his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. In fact, several of the arguments outlined in the critique had already been developed in the Jewish question. Being only an introduction, it was in the nature of a summary, ordering its themes in a way that reflected the different phases of Marx's own development: religious, philosophical, political, revolutionary. Taken as a whole, it formed a manifesto whose incisiveness and dogmatism anticipated the Communist Manifesto of 1848. All the elements of the article were already contained in the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, but there was now a quite new emphasis on the proletariat as future emancipator of society. Although written in Paris, the whole article was orientated towards Germany and the possibility of a German revolution. Accordingly, it started with religion and went on to politics, the two most pressing subjects in Germany, according to his programmatic letter to Ruge of September 1843. Marx began with a brilliant passage on religion summarizing the whole work of the young Hegelian school from Strauss to Feuerbach. So far as Germany is concerned, he wrote, the criticism of religion is essentially complete, and criticism of religion is the presupposition of all criticism.